As the year opened, we had very little to celebrate. The Paris peace talks were at an impasse, and the bombing of North Vietnam had been escalated. The House Democratic Caucus voted overwhelmingly in favor of terminating U.S. military involvement in Indochina. A major clash between Congress and the President seemed imminent when President Nixon announced a bombing halt. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield was one of many senators to voice approval.
I'm assuming that progress is being made, that the prospects are looking up, and this move on our part, I think and hope, would be conducive to bringing about an agreement at the earliest possible opportunity.
Although we seemed closer to peace in Indochina, extensive air battles were taking place in the Middle East. Israeli planes struck Syrian targets in retaliation for guerrilla attacks on the Golan Heights. On January 10th, the Watergate criminal trial began, with Judge John Sirica presiding. 2 days later, defendant Howard Hunt pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy, wiretapping, and second-degree burglary. He asked that other charges be dropped. Outside of the courthouse, Hunt spoke to newsmen.
Gentlemen, I'd like to say this. Anything I may have done, I did for what I believed to be in the best interests of my country. And as a believer in the law, I understood then and understand now the consequences of breaking it.
A few days later, Hunt's co-defendants, Barker, Gonzalez, and Sturgis, pleaded guilty to all 7 counts of the Watergate indictment and adamantly denied being coerced into making this plea.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
And will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God. From this day forward, let each of us make a solemn commitment in his own heart to bear his responsibility, to do his part, to live his ideals, so that together we can see the dawn of a new age of progress for America. And together, as we celebrate our 200th anniversary as a nation, we can do so proud in the fulfillment of our promise to ourselves and to the world.
Although he did not mention the word Vietnam in his address, President Nixon gave assurance that our longest and most difficult war was ending, and that we were standing on the threshold of peace.
Let us be proud that by our bold new initiatives, by our steadfastness for peace with honor, we have made a breakthrough toward creating in the world what the world has not known before, a structure of peace that can last, not merely for our time, but for generations to come.
Would you believe it that the President of the United States has just finished his inaugural speech and not once did he mention the name Vietnam? He talked of a threshold of peace, and we are here to remind him and to let him know that we are not going to stop protesting or start celebrating until a peace agreement is actually signed.
That was Congresswoman Bella Abzug addressing the thousands who gathered in Washington to protest our continued involvement in the Vietnam War.
The following statement is being issued at this moment in Washington and Hanoi. At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Lee Duc-Tho on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The agreement will be formally signed by the parties participating in the Paris Conference on Vietnam on January 27, 1973 at the International Conference Center in Paris. The ceasefire will take effect at 2400 Greenwich Mean Time, January 27, 1973. The United States and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam express the hope that this agreement will ensure stable peace in Vietnam and contribute to the preservation of lasting peace in Indochina and Southeast Asia.
The peace agreement was greeted with a profound sense of relief.
This is a day for which each of us should be thankful to the Lord God. The unwanted Vietnam War raged more than a quarter of a century, divided France and divided this country as we have not been divided for more than 100 years. But we Americans now should take pride in what has been accomplished, the fact that we have a peace, the fact that potentially it can become a lasting peace, the fact that we have a peace that guarantees the return of our prisoners and accountability for our missing.
Other Americans reacted more soberly than Senator Hugh Scott. Daniel Ellsberg felt that we could have reached a similar settlement much earlier. Others felt that the ceasefire wouldn't last. All Americans regretted that former President Lyndon Johnson did not live to see the settlement he so desperately wanted. Before burial in his native Texas, Lyndon Johnson's body was brought to the Capitol Rotunda to lie in state. John Pickle, the congressman from Johnson's own district, spoke lovingly of his mentor.
Now, from his new vantage point, the President will rest in his beloved hill country, where he has told us his daddy before him said he too wanted to come home. Come home, where folks know when you're sick and they care when you die. 200 million Americans care, Mr. President. We care and we love you.
At the end of January, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird announced the end of the military draft. This coincided with the signing of the Vietnam Accords in Paris. The Vietnam settlement had little effect on the war in Cambodia. Prince Norodom Sihanouk announced that his guerrillas would fight until the Nixon administration abandoned Lon Nol or until the regime in Phnom Penh was wiped out. President Nixon announced his budget for fiscal 1974 at the end of January. Funding for several social welfare appropriations was cut by 10%.
Cutting back on federal programs does not mean cutting back on progress. In fact, it means a better way to progress. When we cut $1 million from a federal program, that money is not lost and its power to do good things eliminated. Rather, that money is transferred to other budgets where its power to do good things is multiplied.
President Nixon aroused considerable controversy when he decided to impound $8 billion, which had been appropriated by Congress. Governor Jimmy Carter of Georgia was outraged.
I can't understand how Congress could have given up, against its will, I'm sure. They have previously maintained control over federal budget matters. I think that impoundment of funds after Congress has specifically authorized a program ought to be stopped immediately.
Earlier in the month, the President ended most mandatory wage and price controls. In all areas except food, health, and building, he asked for voluntary cooperation from labor and business. Everyone hoped these Phase 3 measures would further decrease the rate of inflation. And now, here is WBZ sportscaster Guy Manila.
The capacity of sport to entertain a nation was strained to the limit in 1973. There were plenty of thrills, but the shocks from Washington often muted the joy of spectators. January belonged to the Super Bowl, and the Miami Dolphins were almost invincible. They beat Washington 14-7, ending a perfect season with their 17th straight victory. Their only scare on Super Sunday also provided the Super Bowl's big thrill.
The clock is moving. They're not going to get a playoff. 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds. The Dolphins have won Super Bowl VII, have completed the greatest season in NFL history, and that is going to be the end of the ball game as the Dolphins have won it by a score of 14-7.
February brought important developments in Watergate. Prompted by Judge Sirica, the Senate established a committee to further investigate the covert activities of the 1972 presidential campaign. Foremost among these was the break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters. Senators Sam Ervin of North Carolina and Howard Baker of Tennessee were named chairman and vice chairman. Colonel William B. Nolde, the last American to be killed in Vietnam before the ceasefire, was buried in Arlington National Cemetery in early February. Just a week later, the first POWs to be released by the North Vietnamese arrived at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Navy Captain Jeremiah Denton, was the first POW off the plane.
We are honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances. We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day.
As the political situation became calmer in Indochina, tensions came to a head in Northern Ireland. Gunmen fired at mourners attending a funeral for IRA regulars who had been killed by the British. When explosions erupted in Belfast, former Prime Minister Brian Faulkner commented,
"If the security forces have information that anyone as an individual or any body as an organization is indulging in violence, then those people should be put out of circulation. This shouldn't have any political or religious tags attached to it."
Secretary of the Treasury Schultz announced a 10% devaluation of the dollar in February. Although most people approved of the action, Senator William Proxmire felt it was inflationary.
The immediate effect of this devaluation is going to be adverse on the consumer, because it means that everything we buy from abroad, and we buy billions of dollars from abroad, is going to be higher in price. It means that we're going to have to pay probably $2.5 to $3 billion more out of our pockets for what we buy in our regular living than we had to before.
As the month came to a close, accusations flew thick and fast between the United States and North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese accused the U.S. of frustrating the Joint Military Commission and threatened to delay the release of American POWs. In retaliation, the U.S. accused North Vietnam of violating provisions of the Paris Peace Accords. A group of activist American Indians occupied Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and took 11 hostages. Members of the Oglala Sioux tribe exchanged gunfire with federal officers and demanded a full-scale investigation. Indian leader Clyde Bellecourt was there.
We look at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Church, and the Office of Education as the three worst enemies of Indian people. All three of these in collaboration have held the Indian people down, suppressed their religion and their culture all these years.
The relations between the U.S. and China continued to improve throughout March. At the request of President Nixon, the Chinese released Robert Downey after 21 years of imprisonment. 2 days later, President Nixon named Ambassador David Bruce to head a liaison office in Peking. Ironically, author Pearl Buck did not live to see this aspect of détente. The Nobel Prize-winning author had written several popular novels about the Chinese people, including The Good Earth, which won a Pulitzer Prize in 1931. In March, the last American prisoners and troops came home from Vietnam. Cambodia, however, was still torn by fighting. When his life was threatened, Lon Nol declared a state of siege, suspended publication of all non-government periodicals, and arrested members of the royal family. 10 days later, the White House announced that the U.S. would continue bombing Cambodia until communist forces ceased their military offensives. Senator Mark Hatfield objected.
As long as we have American personnel flying American-built aircraft under American military orders, dropping American-made bombs on the people of Southeast Asia, we are involved in war. That is not a 4th of July celebration. That is war. And therefore, we cannot talk about peace with honor or with dishonor, either kind of peace, because we are still in war. And it is, to me, it's a fraudulent claim for anyone to talk about peace when we're still at war.
In Ulster, citizens voted to remain a part of the United Kingdom. Former Prime Minister Brian Faulkner was gratified.
Tremendous result. That puts paid once and for all to any allegations that Northern Ireland is kept in the United Kingdom by force of arms, by oppression, or by anything else. This was the Ulster people quietly speaking their minds through the ballot box.
Violence accompanied the election. Authorities blamed the provisional wing of the IRA for the bombings in Belfast, Londonderry, and London. Watergate was the major news story in March, as it was in most of 1973. After declaring the innocence of the entire White House staff, President Nixon claimed executive privilege for his consul, John Dean, and refused to let him testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was then considering the confirmation of L. Patrick Gray as director of the FBI. The Judiciary Committee had invited Dean to testify after Gray admitted giving him 81 FBI files. Senator Lowell Weicker was highly critical of the executive privilege claim.
Of course, the executive privilege, which he chooses to invoke, is supposed to be based on the national interest. And I think the national interest, in the case of Watergate, is a restoration of faith of the American people in the integrity of their political system. And I think that the national interest is achieved by opening and not closing the White House doors.
A few days later, the New York Times published McCord's allegations that John Dean and Jeb Stuart Magruder, former deputy director of the Committee to Re-elect the President, knew in advance of the Watergate break-in. This charge provoked Magruder's resignation as an Assistant Secretary of Commerce and a statement from Presidential Press Secretary Ron Ziegler.
Last night, on Mr. Dean's behalf, we denied the fact that Mr. Dean had any prior knowledge of the Watergate matter. This morning, President Nixon talked to John Dean, and following that conversation, I can again this morning absolutely deny the fact that Mr. Dean had any prior knowledge of the Watergate matter. It's simply a false report.
Ziegler's statement did little to diminish the furor which had been aroused by McCord's allegations. Consequently, the White House decided to permit its past and present staff to testify in closed sessions of the grand jury and of the Irvin Committee. In early April, the White House withdrew L. Patrick Gray's nomination as director of the FBI. The nomination had been doomed since Gray admitted giving FBI reports to John Dean. At about the same time, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu ended a productive two-day meeting with President Nixon at the Western White House. President Nixon promised the South Vietnamese continued economic aid, but he would not pledge military intervention. Undaunted, Mr. Thieu addressed the Washington Press Club.
I am very confident that our army and our people are very capable to defend themselves against a renewed aggression, because I don't think that when the communists cannot win the war in 1972, I don't believe that they can win the war even they would like to renew another aggression war for 15 more years. I can assure you one thing. Never I will ask any American troops to come back to Vietnam.
In April, criticism of the administration's economic policies was rampant. Consumers expressed their dissatisfaction with the president's meat price ceilings with a well-publicized boycott.
I think it's terrible, and I'm not going to use any meat next week. And my husband says I should keep it up and not go back to buying meat after next week.
Too much for me. I have a family of 9, and we're starting to cut down on the meat portions.
I'm all for the boycott.
Patrick Gorman, head of the Amalgamated Meat Cutters Union, blamed one man for the high prices.
The principal alibier and troublemaker is Earl L. Butz, the United States Secretary of Agriculture, and we're in favor of giving him a kick in that proportion of his anatomy apropos to his name.
Senate opposition to the president's impoundment of funds culminated in the approval of Senator Irvin's resolution, which forbade further presidential impoundment of appropriations.
Baseball started 1973 with a new wrinkle, but only in the American League, where the designated hitter took the pitcher's place at the plate. Over the season, Tommy Davis and Orlando Cepeda compiled the best records.
Here's Cepeda, who would like nothing better than to make his first Red Sox hit a homer, which would win the game. Lyle swings to the motion and throws. Long drive to left field. It's up. It is gone. A home run for Cepeda to win the ball game for Boston.
In France, Pablo Picasso, the father of Cubism, died at the age of 91.
Life is sweet, but time is fleet beneath the magic of the moon. Dancing time may seem sublime, but it is ended all too soon.
That was the voice of Sir Noel Coward, the British playwright, composer, and performer, who died this month at the age of 72. On April 30th,
the President has asked me to announce that he has today received and accepted the resignation of Richard Kleindienst as Attorney General of the United States. He is appointing Elliot Richardson to succeed Mr. Kleindienst as Attorney General, and will submit Mr. Richardson's name to the Senate for confirmation immediately. President Nixon has also asked me to announce that he is today accepting the resignation of 2 of his closest friends and most trusted assistants in the White House, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. The President wishes to emphasize that neither the submission nor the acceptance of Mr. Haldeman's and Mr. Ehrlichman's resignation at this time should be seen by anyone as evidence of any wrongdoing by either one. I've also been asked to announce that the President has today requested and accepted the resignation of John Dean from his position of the White House counsel.
As a result of this tidal wave of resignations, considerable reorganization was needed in the White House. The President named General Alexander Haig to replace H.R. Haldeman as Chief of Staff. J. Fred Bazart was appointed Special Counsel for Watergate matters, and CIA Director James R. Schlesinger was nominated for Secretary of Defense. In early May, Judge Matt Byrne dismissed all charges against Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo. Ellsberg said,
"The war is not over, but in a long struggle, I believe for a long time very strongly that you keep your strength up by celebrating when you have something to celebrate. I think we all here, and I think the country had something to celebrate. Tony and I could celebrate a mistrial and a dismissal, and after meeting our jurors at that party last night, we know we had an acquittal too. So it was a very good day and an evening for us."
The reason for the dismissal was government interference, not only by tapping Ellsberg's phone, breaking and entering his psychiatrist's office to steal medical records, but also by attempting to cover up these offenses. On May 17th, Senator Sam Ervin opened the hearings of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities.
We are beginning these hearings today in an atmosphere of utmost gravity. The questions that have been raised in the wake of the June 17 break-in strike at the very undergirding of our democracy. If the many allegations made to this date are true, then the burglars who broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee after Watergate were in effect breaking into the home of every citizen of the United States. And if these allegations proved to be true, what they were seeking to steal was not the jewels, money, or other property of American citizens, but something much more valuable, their most precious heritage, the right to vote in a free election.
The other committee members were Senators Baker, Talmadge, Inouye, Montoya, Gurney, and Weicker. Sam Dash and Fred Thompson served as majority and minority counsels. The first witness was Robert Odle, Director of Administration at CRP, the committee to re-elect the President.
And somebody came by the door and they said, "Have you heard there's been a burglary at the Democratic National Committee?" And I said to some people who were in that meeting who were not from the committee, I said, "That could never happen here because I have this guy working for me named Jim McCord." And he's got this place really tight. And all I can say is I'm glad McCord works for me.
Convicted Watergate burglar James McCord followed Odle to the stand.
Political pressure from the White House was conveyed to me in January 1973 by John Caulfield to remain silent, take executive clemency by going off to prison quietly, and I was told that while there I would receive financial aid and later rehabilitation and a job. I was further told in a January meeting in 1973 with Caulfield that the President of the United States was aware of our meeting, that the results of the meeting would be conveyed to the President, and that at a future meeting there would likely be a personal message from the President himself.
Even though McCord's charge against the President was based on hearsay, it was extremely damaging, for he was charging the President of the United States with an impeachable offense. 4 days later, former presidential assistant John Caulfield contradicted McCord's testimony.
I believed that I was going back to see Mr. McCord to again extend an offer of executive clemency, and that by doing so, I was doing a great service for the President of the United States in a very sensitive matter. At no time, either before or after this meeting with Mr. Dean, did I ever speak to any other White House officials about this offer of executive clemency. I specifically never spoke to the President of the United States and have no knowledge of my own as to whether he personally had endorsed this offer or indeed whether anyone had ever discussed it with him.
The Senate Judiciary Committee met in mid-May to consider the confirmation of Elliot Richardson as Attorney General. One of the conditions for Richardson's confirmation was that he appoint a special Watergate prosecutor who would have complete independence.
I'm pleased to report today that, if confirmed by the Senate, I intend to name Archibald Cox, former Solicitor General of the United States, now Williston Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School, as the special prosecutor.
Richardson and Cox were confirmed readily and sworn in before the end of the month. Here is WBZ sportscaster Guy Manila.
The UCLA Bruins added yet another NCAA basketball championship, their 7th in a row. Hockey had 2 champions in 1973. Montreal won the Stanley Cup again, and the New England Whalers took the first World Hockey Association championship.
Cuddy's got it behind the net, feeds it out to the right side. For Milt Black, 11 seconds. Dorey down deep into his own zone. Dorey throws it down to the Winnipeg zone. Picked up by Cuddy. They're counting down the clock. 2 seconds, 1 second, it's all over. And the Whalers are the first WHA champions.
The Indianapolis 500 was bloody. 2 drivers and a pit crew member were killed, another driver badly burned, before Gordon Johncock won the delayed, crash-marred, and rain-shortened version of the Fame 500. In the professional ranks, the Knickerbockers returned to the NBA's throne room, beating the Los Angeles Lakers.
The New York Knicks have defeated the Los Angeles Lakers by the score of 102-93. The New York Knicks winning their 2nd championship of all time, their 2nd within 4 years, both coming at the expense of the Los Angeles Lakers.
In May, only 2 national events shared the headlines with Watergate. The first was the signing of an agreement which ended the 68-day occupation of Wounded Knee. The second was an overwhelming decision by the Senate to cut off funds for further bombing of Cambodia. In Indochina, the fighting continued. Senator Edward Brooke observed the skirmishes.
In Vietnam, though much progress has been made in the return of prisoners and the withdrawal of American troops, there are still hostilities. I heard shooting last night when I was in Saigon. When I was in Phnom Penh, the effects of the B-52 bombing shook the house in which I was. The windows were shaking. When I was in Laos, it was indicated to me that hostilities were still going on.
The Irvin Committee hearings continued throughout June, despite Special Prosecutor Cox's request for a postponement.
The committee has carefully considered the request of the Special Prosecutor of the so-called Watergate case, and has unanimously determined that its duty requires it to decline to grant such request for these reasons. First, the committee has been authorized and directed by a resolution unanimously adopted by the Senate to investigate the so-called Watergate affair and its ramifications, and to recommend to the Congress adoption of any legislation it deems necessary and appropriate as a result of its findings, and for this reason has no authority to postpone or terminate these activities under the Senate resolution. Second, the committee is unwilling to share the fails of the Special Prosecutor that the courts will permit guilty parties to go unwhipped of justice simply because the Senate committee exercises the constitutional rights and obligations of the Senate to inform the Congress and the American people of the truth in respect to the Watergate affair. Third, the committee believes that there is more likelihood that any other persons who may be indicted will be able to obtain a fair trial in an atmosphere of judicial calm after, rather than before, the committee completes its task.
Hugh Sloan, Nixon's campaign treasurer, testified that Jeb Stuart Magruder, the deputy director of the campaign, had suggested that he lie to the grand jury about enormous cash payments to Watergate defendants. Sloan spoke more favorably about his former boss, Maurice Stans.
Part of the considered judgment to rejoin the Finance Committee is that I did not and do not believe that Secretary Stans in any way was involved in the original criminal activities. I thought he was left essentially holding the bag, and I wanted to be helpful to him in that regard.
Stans declined to appear before the Watergate Committee for reasons his lawyer, Robert Barker, explained.
Under our constitutional system and the fundamental laws of this land, an accused is entitled to a fair trial by an impartial jury, unimpeded by a deluge of publicity. In other words, as the Supreme Court said in Estes versus Texas, the concept of due process of law entitles the defendant to, and I quote, both judicial serenity and calm, end of quote. Now, Mr. Chairman, the inevitable clique light of publicity which will result from Mr. Stan's appearance here would preclude any judicial serenity and calm at the trial now set, as I say, for September 11 in New York. It would also tend to deny him the possibility of an impartial jury of the kind guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment.
Although Mr. Stan's request was denied, the committee agreed not to question him about the Vesco case. Stans appeared on June 12th and immediately denied any involvement in the Watergate affair.
First, I had no knowledge of the Watergate break-in or any other espionage efforts before I read about them in the press or of the efforts to cover up after the event. Second, I had no knowledge of any sabotage program to disrupt the campaign by Segretti or anyone else. Thirdly, to the best of my knowledge, there were no intentional violations of the laws relating to campaign financing by the finance committees for which I had responsibility. Because of the complexity of the new law that became effective in the course of the campaign and the vast amount of work that had to be done under the new law, there may have been some unintended technical violations by the committee.
Jeb Stuart Magruder was the next witness. In the course of his testimony, Magruder admitted his own involvement in the planning of the Watergate break-in and in the subsequent cover-up. He also implicated Dean, Mitchell, and Haldeman.
Oh, I think there was no question that the cover-up began that Saturday when we realized it was a break-in. I don't think there was ever any discussion that there wouldn't be a cover-up.
Magruder was the last witness to testify before the committee recessed for the visit of Soviet Party leader Leonid Brezhnev. During a very successful 10-day summit, the two world leaders signed 9 important agreements. One accelerated the SALT talks. Another expanded cooperation in oceanography, transportation, and agricultural exchanges. The most crucial, made nuclear warfare less of a threat than it has been since the bomb was first developed. Immediately before departing, Brezhnev spoke through an interpreter to the American people.
In 6 or 8 months' time, as the President wishes, we will be able to meet again when the President comes to Moscow. And when we do that, we will move still further ahead the very important achievements started last year in May. And he will come to the Soviet Union confident that we will prepare and sign new and more important agreements which will develop all that was started so well last year in Moscow.
And Henry Kissinger met with Le Docteau in Paris. During the negotiations, Dr. Kissinger displayed great wit, evading newsmen's questions about the talks.
I agree with what Monsieur Joubert said in Luxembourg about the summit. Always think of it, never speak of it.
A couple of weeks later, Dr. Kissinger announced that an agreement to end ceasefire violations had been signed. In Greece, Premier George Papadopoulos announced that the military government had abolished the monarchy and proclaimed a republic. An election for premier would be held before the end of 1973, and Premier Papadopoulos, the only candidate on the ballot, would be re-elected. Exiled King Constantine had this to say.
At this moment of great trial and crisis, I wish to assure the Greek people that I, King of the Hellenes, have not only the hope, but the unshakable conviction that I shall return to my beloved country as a guarantor of the dignity and of the constitutional liberty of the Greek people.
Former President Juan Perón returned to Argentina after 20 years in exile. Violence marred Perón's return and forced him to cancel an address to the more than 1 million Argentinians who gathered to greet him. In Spain, Generalissimo Francisco Franco relinquished his powers as premier to a faithful aide, Admiral Luis Blanco. Franco remained chief of state and commander-in-chief of the army. An assassin's bullet would kill Blanco before Christmas. In June, the President and the Congress finally reached a compromise about the fighting in Cambodia. This compromise took the form of an amendment to an appropriations bill, which Senator Hugh Scott explained.
It cuts off all funds herein, hereafter, or heretofore
involved. If there were to be any future military action in Southeast Asia, it is my judgment as a senator that the President would have to make a specific request which would require approval of a majority of both houses of Congress. Therefore, I would assume that this action ends on August 15th. Our participation in the hostilities in Southeast Asia, and as you know, I announced some time ago that I could only support that policy through tomorrow, midnight, June 30th.
In another attempt to control rampant inflation, President Nixon announced a 60-day freeze on all retail prices except rents, interest, and dividends. George Meany was highly critical of this measure.
We have no confidence in any system or program of controls based upon the perpetuation of special privileges and misguided incentives that breed inflation and distort the economy. We are prepared to express our views in detail to representatives of the administration in the course of any consultations that may take place.
The Skylab 2 astronauts describe some of their experience in a very special news conference from outer space. Here is Commander Joseph Kerwin.
Medically and subjectively, what's been such a pleasant big surprise to me is how nice we feel. We're able to get up in the morning, eat breakfast, and do a day's work. I'm tremendously encouraged about the future of long-duration flight for that particular reason.
2 days later, after having broken a world record by spending 28 days in space, the astronauts returned safely to Earth. The Supreme Court ruled on 5 obscenity cases in June. According to the rulings, states could ban books, magazines, plays, and movies which were considered offensive by local standards. This Supreme Court decision provoked even more controversy than the January decision on abortion. The Watergate hearings resumed on June 25th with the testimony of former presidential counsel John Dean. In a prepared 6-hour statement, Mr. Dean described the extensive efforts employed in masking the Watergate conspiracy. He implicated Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and the president himself.
What I had hoped to do in this conversation was to have the president tell me we had to end the matter now. Accordingly, I gave considerable thought to how I would present this situation to the president and try to make as dramatic a presentation as I could to tell him how serious I thought the situation was that the cover-up continue. I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and that if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it. I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day.
The charges against the president were devastating. What started as an investigation of campaign corruption had become a threat to the president's ability to govern. Outside of the hearing room, Senator Baker commented on the key issue raised by Dean's testimony.
Now, there are certain statements made by Mr. Dean that are allegedly very private statements, just the 2 of them. And I'm sure the committee will have to think about how we can weigh and assess the accuracy of those statements. And I'm sure the president will have to think about what, if any, statement he wishes to make in that respect. Once again, I'm not prepared to give advice to the president in that respect, but it's a key issue. And it would seem to me that in a one-on-one situation, as Mr. Dean alleges, that the committee will certainly very urgently need some further illumination.
Dean also revealed that the White House had an enemies list, and that the people on the list had often been harassed by government agencies. Senators Baker and Ervin reacted to this disclosure with a touch of humor.
I can't forbear observing, when I consider the list of opponents, why the Democratic vote was so light in the general election.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I really, even in my wildest dreams, would not think of trying to improve on or embellish your story. But you told it better the first time. When you leaned over to me and you said, I think I'm going to demand a recount. There are more enemies than we got votes.
Although the president refused to comment on the bombshells which were being dropped almost daily by Watergate witnesses, it's clear that he considered John Dean to be the crucial witness he was. for the White House tried to discredit Dean in a statement that Senator Inouye read at the hearings.
It would appear that the groundwork is being laid to establish the innocence of the President and Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman. And the memo seems to indicate rather clearly that in the belief of those in the White House, it was Mr. Dean who was responsible for all.
The spring of 1973 belonged not to men but to a horse. Secretariat ended a 25-year wait for a Triple Crown winner, thrilling the nation with a record in the Kentucky Derby, a near record in the Preakness, and then an incredible record-smashing performance in the Belmont Stakes.
Around the turn, and Secretariat is so far out in front, he's absolutely making a joke of the 105th Belmont. Secretariat at the 8th pole now, way out in front by some 20 lengths. Secretariat absolutely won, I don't know how far. I've never called a race where a horse won by over 25, and we won't know what the correct margin is. But Secretariat not only wins the 105th Belmont, completes the Triple Crown, but does it in record time, running the distance in 2 minutes, 24 seconds flat.
John Mitchell began his testimony before the Irvin Committee in early July. He assured Majority Counsel Sam Dash that from the beginning he had rejected the bizarre espionage schemes proposed by Liddy.
To your best recollection, was the intelligence plan that Mr. Liddy presented to you as Attorney General or in your role as advisor, the Committee for the Re-election of the President?
Well, I think it can be best described as a complete horror story that involved a mishmash of code names and lines of authority, electronic surveillance, the ability to intercept aircraft communications, the call girl bit, and all the rest of it.
Do you recall the use of charts in a show-and-tell operation?
I recall the use of charts because this is where the lines were all crossing with the authority, et cetera, et cetera.
Do you recall any of the code names that were used, Mr. Mitchell?
No, I can't, Mr. Dash. The matter was of such a striking content and concept that it just was beyond the pale.
Well, when Liddy completed his presentation, what was your reaction?
Well, I think it was very simple. As I recall, I told him to go burn the charts and that this was not what we were interested in. What we were interested in was a matter of information gathering and the protection against the demonstrators.
Well, Mr. Mitchell, if this was the kind of plan as you described and has been described this way by other witnesses before this committee, and since you were the Attorney General of the United States, why didn't you throw Mr. Liddy out of your office?
Well, I think, Mr. Dash, in hindsight, I not only should have thrown him out of the office, I should have thrown him out of the window.
In response to a question from Senator Talmadge, Mitchell admitted holding back information about Watergate from the president. Senators Irvin and Weicker found the president's ignorance about Watergate extremely unlikely and continued to question Mitchell on that point.
Do any other thoughts or ideas come to mind on how we can gain access to this information and perception of the president and still try to avoid an institutional confrontation between the Congress and the president on these doctrines?
Yes, Senator. There's one that very much comes to my mind, that you and the chairman can go down and discuss it with him. And I'm sure that you may find some mutual grounds upon which to resolve this problem.
Dear Mr. President, I acknowledge receipt of your letter of July the 6th addressed to me with a copy to Senator Baker. The committee feels that your position, as stated in the letter, measured against the committee's responsibility to ascertain the facts related to the matter set out in Senate Resolution 60, present the very grave possibility of a fundamental constitutional confrontation between the Congress and the presidency. We wish to avoid that if possible. Consequently, we request an opportunity for representatives of this committee and its staff to meet with you and your staff to try to find ways to avoid such a confrontation. We stand ready to discuss the matter with you at your convenience. We would point out that the hearings are ongoing and that time is of the essence. We trust that this may be done very promptly. Very truly yours, Sam J. Irvin, Jr., Chairman.
The letter arrived at the White House at a most inopportune time, for a day later, the president was hospitalized with viral pneumonia. Former presidential aide Alexander Butterfield added a disturbing new dimension to the Watergate investigation.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
When were those devices placed in the Oval Office?
Approximately the summer of 1970. I cannot begin to recall the precise date. My guess is that the installation was made between, and this is a very rough guess, April or May of 1970 and perhaps the end of the summer or early fall 1970.
According to Butterfield, the device operated automatically from the president's phones in the Oval Office, the Executive Office building, his sitting room, and Camp David. Butterfield told Fred Thompson the president's reasons for the bugging.
Well, there was no doubt in my mind that they were installed to record things for posterity, for the Nixon Library. The president was very conscious of that kind of thing. We had quite an elaborate setup at the White House for the collection and preservation of documents and of things which transpired in the way of business of state.
On whose authority were they installed, Mr. Butterfield?
On the president's authority by way of Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Higbee.
He also maintained that this type of bugging had been going on for years. No one in the Senate was pleased that his calls to the president may have been recorded, least of all Henry Jackson.
It reeks of the worst kind of totalitarianism. It reeks of what would be in another country called a police state. And I'm flabbergasted that this kind of activity has been going on at the summit of government, the White House. What a poor example to set to all citizens on the right of privacy.
The Irvin Committee and Special Prosecutor Cox lost no time in requesting the tapes. The White House promptly agreed to release the tapes, or so it seemed. Hours later, Senator Irvin announced the most recent dirty trick of the Watergate affair.
I was informed that Secretary Schultz was indeed on the phone, and I went to the phone and had a conversation with the man who really assured me he was the real Secretary Schultz. And he informed me that he'd had no conversation with me today, that whoever did it was somebody else. That the only conversation he's had with me recently by telephone rather he called me yesterday to tell me that something about the White House, the witnesses from the Secret Service. So it's just an awful thing for a very trusting soul like me to find that there are human beings, if you can call them such, who would perpetrate a hoax like this.
On July 23rd, a recuperated president refused the requests of the Irvin Committee and the special prosecutor on the grounds of executive privilege and separation of powers. He added that the tapes were consistent with his past statements about Watergate, but that they might be misconstrued. The committee promptly subpoenaed the tapes and other Watergate material.
Upon the receipt of this communication from the White House, the Select Committee held a meeting and unanimously voted to authorize and direct the chairman to issue two subpoenas, one requiring the president to produce the tapes, which are to be described in the subpoena, and the other requiring the president to make available to the committee the tapes which will be described in the subpoena, and the presidential papers, that is, the papers, the White House papers that are to be described in the subpoena.
Cox also subpoenaed the material he had previously only requested. When both subpoenas were respectfully refused, court orders requiring the president to release the material were sought. The controversy about the tapes did not impede other important congressional action. The Senate authorized the licensing of the Alaska pipeline. Senators Ted Stevens and Mike Gravel explained their amendment, which made it possible.
It means we're going to go ahead with the Alaska pipeline and start the action to bring 2 million barrels a day that will save $6 million in foreign exchange and make available to the nation new oil, 2 million barrels a day of new oil.
American oil, we might underscore, because as we try to satisfy our growing appetite, we're now having to move from a position of sufficiency to dependency, and dependency upon the Middle East.
The President would sign the pipeline bill in the fall, when Mideast fuel would be scarce in this part of the world. The President announced Phase 4 of his fight against inflation in mid-July. All previously established price freezes, except those covering beef, would expire on August 12th. The freeze on beef prices would end on September 12th. Secretary of the Treasury Schultz commented,
"We have not tried to make a precise estimate, and I guess I would say in all modesty that our record on forecasting what's going to happen to food prices leaves you